he points out that within the soul, it's only the present time that is real. The past is not now except in present memory of the past. But that's present and real. The memory is real. The future is not yet, but it is present in one's present anticipation of the future. And so in the present experience of the soul, at this juncture, you see, the past becomes present by virtue of memory. The future becomes present in anticipation, but only that present is real. That sounds like a tangled sort of way of doing things, but it's true, our experience, isn't it? You now can enjoy anticipations of the future. You now can enjoy memories of the past, but you enjoy them now, in the present. So then it follows that times come into existence and pass away. Time is the realm of change, of becoming, and passing out of existence. The realm of generation and disintegration. Time. That's the Augustinian view of time. Do you catch that Augustinian note in the familiar hymn that goes, change and decay in all around I see? Change and decay in all around I see. Okay then, it's the present time that is real, yet by the same token, all times are present in the soul. The past is present, the future is present. All of these times are present in the soul. And the soul experiences them as an ever-present now. It's now that you experience the past and the future, in the now. So all times are present now in the soul. Now, grasp that, and you can see what he means when he talks of God as eternal, unchanging, and timeless. God as eternal, unchanging, and timeless. Because if there is no change in God, following the Greek model, if there is no change in God, then there is no past that has ceased to be in God, or any future that hasn't yet come into being. God is without change, therefore without, in that sense, time. Nothing changes in God or in God's thought, because all the time he has perfect knowledge of all our past times and future times. He is in that sense beyond time, timeless himself. Yes, God's knowledge then is of timeless things, of timeless exemplars. God's knowledge is knowledge of the forms, of those timeless exemplars which do not come into being or pass out of being. And he knows particulars through knowing the forms which give them their being. So when God created the heaven and the earth, he created change and times that become past, that come and go. So then, human life is distinct from the divine life. Human knowledge is going to be different from the divine knowledge. And even our knowing of eternal truths is going to be different from God's direct and intuitive knowledge of those eternal truths. The human soul, then, is in the realm of change. Does that come together? After reading Dr. Seuss at that hilarious evening last night, I'm wondering whether what you're hearing is the rattle of words or the ideas today. Because to talk of times that become and pass away could be just the rattling of rhymes in Dr. Seuss. You see. Do you get the idea? I mean the idea of Augustine, not Seuss. Yes, Janelle.
I'm a little bit unsure on how we do identify God.
Say that again, how nature is influenced?
Please explain how the thought of God and the nature and the natural world relate.
Oh, okay. God's thought consists of the rationes aeternae, those eternal truths in the mind of God. What God thinks is unchanging forms. Okay. Now, when God creates a world of change, you see, what he's doing is creating a world that participates in those archetypal forms, yes, a world that is ordered with the presence of the seminal forms, the rationes seminales. But in a world of change, its embodying of those particular forms is something which comes to be and passes away. Okay. Now, we do not know the forms as they are in the mind of God directly. We don't have that sort of insight into the divine essence. God does, so he has perfect knowledge of that. But search as we will in our own souls, we find time coming to be, passing away. Our experience of particulars. But our experience of particulars is such that the mind enlightened by the Logos, we're able to recognize the essences, the natures, the form of things in the world of particulars. Does that help? Yup, and that's the obvious question that gets the medievals into trouble. And it seems as if they want to have it both ways. Because on the one hand, Augustine talks of God who loves me and knows me in and out. Yet on the other hand, he talks of God who knows the forms. You see. Now, can it be a knowledge of both? The question is, what is the relationship of, and here we'd better get over here, what's the relationship of the individual me to the forms, to the exemplars. And Augustine seems to be thinking that there are a variety of forms in which I participate. A variety of forms in which I participate. The form of humanness. Presumably the form of boldness. This, that, and the other form of physical properties, other kinds of qualities. And so in knowing a particular combination of many forms, you see, he knows me as the particular combining these many forms. Now, that reading of Augustine, it's a reading of Augustine, anticipates the way in which some of the later medievals see it. That individuation, and that's the term that's involved in this discussion, that individuation is secured by virtue of a peculiarly individual combination of many possible forms. That's not going to satisfy everybody. So that when we come after Aquinas to Duns Scotus, we'll find Duns Scotus wants to say that in addition to all the various forms in which I participate, there is still the nature of me, the thisness of me. You see, haikaitas, thisness. And a century later, half a century later, William of Ockham is saying, forget the forms. All that exists is me and the other me, individuals. Why do you need the forms? So your question's crucial. You see, it's striking that one of the liabilities of a theory of forms, namely, that even if it can account for individuality, as distinct from the nature of the species, even if a theory of forms can account for individuality, it still seems to put the primacy on the universal and a lower value on individuality. Get that? A lower value? And that's implicit in the hierarchy of being, where the individual who participates imperfectly in certain ideals is lower on the hierarchy than. So real problems there. Aquinas tries to do it by a theory of what are called substantial forms, individual natures. That God knows my individual nature in some way. Well, that's the shape of things to come. Okay. Watch the question, David. Well, he avoids Plato's problem in a way, inasmuch as he has God as an active, efficient, powerful cause, which Plato didn't have. But he perhaps loses the advantage of Plotinus that individuality is generated by the process of emanation. Yeah. I think one could respond that for Augustine, what God creates, however, is always individuals. God creates individuals with rationes seminales, with seminal forms. Yeah, I suppose it might be, though you don't find Augustine referring to Aristotle. Aristotle's writings seem to have been lost at that stage, weren't recovered until later. So any Aristotle that he knows would be via the Aristotelian elements in Plotinus. You see. So you're right in sensing something there, although the conception of eternity as timelessness, unchanging, goes back to Plato himself. You see. The debate continues in philosophical theology to this day as to whether God is timeless or not. You get basically two different views of eternity. One is that eternity is timelessness. The other that eternity is everlastingness. Everlasting? Yes, through succession of times. And by and large, the Platonic influence is towards timelessness. And I think, in many cases, the Aristotelian influence. Whereas everlastingness seems to be a more, a more modern view, although I think it's closer to the Hebrew view as well. But there's volumes of literature on this subject. If you're interested, there's a book by Nelson Pike, T-I-K-E, teaches at, I think it's University of California in Irvine, a book called God and Timelessness, which makes the case against the timelessness view.
You said Augustine had kind of knowledge.
Yeah. It does, doesn't it? I'm not sure that there is difference, you see, and it's by virtue of buying into the theory of forms, which are unchanging and eternal, that Augustine also buys into the view that God, essentially the form of all forms, is unchanging and timeless. So I'm not sure there's difference. The difference is in the way in which it's spelled out. That is to say, this introspective psychology of time is Augustine's doing. And of course, the way in which it's spelled out in a doctrine of creation rather than emanation is Augustine's doing. But basically, the view of God as timeless and without change is Plato's view. And I think it poses problems. It poses problems in making sense of certain kinds of biblical language. You see? Because if a being is without change, in Aristotle's sense, that being cannot act at a point in time. Because then he would change from not acting in that way at that point to acting in that way at that point. You see? Poses problems of what it would mean for there to be joy in heaven over sinners that repent. That is to say, the satisfaction of seeing what was anticipated actually occurring. It would be difficult to make sense out of God having purposes that he's working on. You see? Because notions of purpose are time-oriented. And so what you have to do is to recast all of those concepts into a different conceptual framework than the ordinary English language seems to connote. This creates the problem. Which is precisely why some people argue for eternity as everlastingness rather than timelessness. And I prefer that latter view, everlastingness. Yeah. Go.
Another question. We've been talking about the forms of eternal. I see you said God thinks on or thinks about the eternal forms.
Yeah.
My problem, if I understand the distinction between the eternal and the particular, my problem is with the action of thinking. understand how eyes can relate to, as a changing medium, can relate in a changing way to changing forms. But I can't see a definition of thinking that doesn't involve change. And that's really right.
Yeah. Certainly thinking in the sense of following a line of argument, or following a line of reflection which meanders from one focus to another, involves changing focus, changing attention to a step in the logical process. Okay? But I think regardless of one's view of eternity, when we say that God thinks, we don't mean that God works through syllogisms to logical conclusions. You see, God doesn't have to go through that process. If your mind is quick, you jump to conclusion. But God's there first, as it were. He sees the end of the line of thought intuitively. Now, if you're thinking, however, of God being omniscient, all-knowing, does that mean that God has, in his active, conscious focus of attention, and I'll add at all times, for the sake of those who think of eternity as everlastingness, does that mean that God has all things at all times in the active, conscious focus of his attention, so that there is no change in the focus of his thought? You see? Well, that's where the difficulty in making use of the ordinary language statements of Scripture, for instance, creates problems. Because what would it mean that, for instance, God saying, "Their sins will I remember no more"? Or what about the figure of speech, that it repented God that he had done such and such? You see, it seems to talk of a change of mind. You see. So I think the language of timelessness in God's thought, while it can handle very easily the notion that God doesn't have to work through syllogisms, it seems to create difficulty in the sense that God's attitude towards something changes. That would have to become simply phenomenal language, the language of the way it appeals to humans. You see. But in reality, well, what is it in reality? And you get a kind of, stuck with a kind of metaphorical language in talking about God, and begin to wonder whether you're really doing theology or just anthropology when you talk about God. You're talking about our experience, right? You're talking about God. You see the problem? It's the kind of problem that Kant and Kierkegaard and others run into. Yeah. Modern theology is very much aware of. In Augustine? No, there's very... Oh, take it back. Is it only through illumination? Well, you see, there is no knowledge of anything apart from divine illumination. So it's a truism to say that knowledge of God is through illumination. No, you see, if it's solely by illumination, the mind would be passive and you wouldn't even be, therefore, knowing. That's an active verb. Illumination enlightens the mind so that you can see with the mind's eye. You see? But you have to see in the illumination. Yeah, okay. How do we know God? Yeah, that is to say, reflecting on the creation, its beauty, its order, its forms, yes, one comes to conceive of the source of beauty, goodness, order, form, in which all the creation participates. Okay? So in that sense, he'd say, yeah, the heavens declare the glory of God. Yes, and that argument for the existence of God from truths to truth, you see, could in that sense be paralleled by an argument from goods to good, beauties to beauty, get it? Forms to formness, and so forth. So yeah, there is some natural knowledge of God. That's possible. And I think anybody would be very hard-pressed consistently to deny that, because it would mean, if there were no natural knowledge of God, that there would be no concept of God outside of access to some special divine self-revelation. You see, and that simply isn't the case. There's a lot of concept of God, various sorts. But how do we get beyond that natural knowledge of God? And that's the question I'd like to pick up on religious experience. Okay? And that's the question because in the Platonic tradition, Neoplatonic tradition, as we've noticed, there is a mystical approach to God. Well, what about Augustine? You see, that's the obvious question. All right, in Book 10 of his Confessions, he asks, what do I love when I love God? What do I love when I love God? And his reflection on this goes through a series of steps. Step number 1. It's not that I love physical beauty when I love God.